My father stood at the head of the table with his champagne glass raised and smiled at everyone, except me. I counted the guests. 42. 42 people in the private dining room of Carmichael's restaurant in Naperville, Illinois, on the night of my parents' 35th anniversary. 42 people who knew my family the way people know families they see at church and school, board meetings, and neighborhood fundraisers. The surface of them, the presented version, the one that my mother had spent 27 years polishing to a shine. My name is Cora Bellamy Rush. I am 31 years old, and I had spent the previous 6 months quietly building something none of them knew about. My father cleared his throat the way he always did when he was about to make an announcement. He said, "Before we begin, your mother and I have some wonderful news to share about the business." The business was Bellamy Interior Design, the firm my parents had founded in 1992, the firm I had been working in for 8 years, the firm I had single-handedly kept operationally functional during the 18 months my parents took a step back for my father's health issues. My father said, "We're proud to announce that we've brought on our daughter Priya as creative director, effective immediately. She'll be leading all client relationships going forward." 42 people applauded. Priya, my younger sister, raised her glass from the other end of the table and smiled the smile she had been perfecting since she was 9 years old, and understood that a well-timed smile could rearrange a room. She had been at the firm for 4 months. I had been there for 8 years. I sat between a couple I did not know well and my cousin Marcus, who was already looking at his phone, and I did not move, and I did not put my glass down before everyone else. And I did not allow the smile to leave my face, because the smile was the only thing in that room I still controlled. And underneath the smile, in the folder in my bag, in the documents my attorney had reviewed and countersigned 3 days earlier, was the thing that was going to change every calculation anyone in that room had made about what they were entitled to. They had no idea. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is what makes everything else make sense. I am the elder of 2 daughters of Martin and Diane Bellamy. My father is 61, a formally trained architect who pivoted to interiors in his late 20s when he met my mother and discovered that she had the commercial instinct he lacked, and he had the spatial precision she needed. They were a genuine partnership in the founding years, his eye and her business sense, 2 things that were each necessary and neither sufficient on its own. Bellamy Interior Design was their product in the truest sense, built from a shared vision across the first decade, and then sustained by my mother's relentless client relationship management across the 2 decades after. My mother, Diane, was 58, and had a talent for making people feel like the most important person in the room, which is the single most valuable skill available in a business that required its clients to trust your judgment about their most personal spaces. She remembered every client's anniversary and their children's names and the specific style evolution of their taste across multiple projects. She was brilliant at her work. She was also the person who had organized our family's social reality around Priya for as long as I could remember, with the specific unconscious logic of a woman who had identified one daughter as the one who needed managing and the other as the one who would manage herself. I was the one who managed herself. Priya was 28, 3 years younger, and had the specific quality of the younger child who has learned that charm is more efficient than competence. She was not incompetent. She had a design degree and a functional aesthetic sense. She was simply not thorough. She did not verify. She did not document. She had a gift for presenting work in the finished state without communicating anything about the process that had produced it, which meant that in any room where the product was visible and the process was invisible, she looked as capable as anyone. In family settings, the process was always invisible. I had joined Bellamy Interior Design at 23, 2 years out of a master's degree in project management with a concentration in design operations. I had not been given a title for the first 3 years. I had been introduced to clients as Martin and Diane's daughter, who handles the operational side, which was accurate in the way that calling someone who runs a hospital the person who handles the medical side is technically accurate. I managed every project from contract to delivery. I built the vendor database. I created the client communication protocol that reduced post-project disputes by 60%. I developed the project tracking system that my parents still used, and that had, in a review by a business consultant they had brought in the year before my father's health issues, been identified as the primary reason the firm's client retention rate was significantly above industry standard. My father's health issues arrived when I was 26. A cardiac event that was serious enough to require surgery and an extended recovery, and a period of reduced professional activity that lasted, in its most significant phase, for 14 months. During those 14 months, I ran the firm, not nominally, not as a placeholder. I made the decisions, managed the vendors, handled the client relationships, pitched new projects, resolved the disputes, and kept the financial position stable through a period when my parents were understandably focused on something more important than quarterly revenue. The firm did not lose a single major client during those 14 months. I received a thank you card from my mother when my father recovered. It had a watercolor bird on the front. Inside, she had written, "We couldn't have done it without you. We love you so much." No raise, no title change, no formal acknowledgement in the firm's materials. I noted this. I continued working. Priya had been, during my father's recovery, living in Chicago doing freelance styling work for a residential client base. She was good at it in the visual sense. She had a following on social media, where she posted transformation photographs that accumulated engagement from people who liked before and afters, and did not need to know about the vendor management and contract negotiation and client communication that preceded and followed every photograph. My mother, during my father's recovery, had begun consulting Priya by phone about aesthetic decisions, not the operational ones, which she knew I was handling. The design ones, which tile, which fabric, which furniture arrangement for a staging project. I was not involved in these consultations. I was managing the operations that made the consultations possible. I did not receive the creative consultation calls because I was not identified, in my family's framework, as the creative one. Priya was the creative one. This had been decided sometime in our childhood and had never been formally revisited despite the evidence of 8 years of my professional record. When my father recovered and returned to the firm in a reduced capacity, he and my mother had a series of conversations that I was not part of and that I became aware of gradually. Through the specific peripheral observation available to someone who has been the invisible operational engine of an organization for long enough that people forget she is in the room. The conversations were about the firm's future leadership. My mother wanted Priya involved. She had said this to my father in the kitchen on a Saturday morning when she believed I had not yet arrived for the weekly planning meeting I attended every Saturday. I had arrived early. I had heard the relevant sentences. My father had concerns. He expressed them in the careful language of a man who understood his wife well enough to frame resistance as process. How will Priya transition in? What does the role look like? What's the timeline? My mother had answers. She had already thought about this. She had a title, creative director, and a plan, client relationship transfer, and a timeline, 60 days. She had thought about it far enough in advance to have answers to her husband's questions on a Saturday morning in the kitchen. She had not thought about me, or rather, she had. She had thought about me as the person who would handle the transition logistics the way I handled all logistics. She had thought about me as the operational infrastructure over which Priya would be placed as the visible leadership. She had thought about me in the specific way she always thought about me as the thing that was there. I want to be accurate here. This was not malice. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had spent 27 years dividing her daughters into roles that made sense to her. The capable one who ran things and the expressive one who presented things, and had become so accustomed to those roles that she had stopped examining whether the roles were fair or accurate or the way either of her daughters actually wanted to live. The role I had been assigned was invisible management. The role Priya was being assigned was visible leadership. Neither of them had asked me how I felt about the arrangement. I found out the specifics not from a conversation, but from a document. 6 weeks before the anniversary dinner, I had been in the firm's file system retrieving a vendor contract when I found a draft employment agreement in a folder labeled Priya Onboarding. The agreement listed her title, her compensation, and her responsibilities. The responsibilities included leading all client relationships. Her compensation was $23,000, a year more than mine. I sat at my desk in the firm's office, the office I had managed for 8 years. At the desk I had bought for the office using the firm's vendor discount I had negotiated, and I read the employment agreement 3 times. Then I opened my own employment file. My title was Operations Director, which my parents had given me formally 2 years earlier after the business consultant's review had specifically recommended that my role be titled and compensated appropriately. My compensation had been adjusted at that point. It was still, I understood now, $23,000 below the number in the agreement I had just found, for a role that had not existed 4 months ago, for a person who had been at the firm for 4 months. I photographed the document with my phone. I closed the folder. I returned the vendor contract to my desk. I finished the afternoon's work with the specific competence that was my professional signature, because the work was real and the clients depended on it, and nothing I had just found changed the immediate obligations of the day. Then I drove home. I sat in my apartment, a 2-bedroom in Naperville that I had lived in for 4 years and had furnished well because I understood design and could execute it, and I thought about 14 months, about a thank you card with a watercolor bird, about the operational infrastructure over which a visible leadership was being placed. I made a call that I had been considering for 6 weeks and had not yet made. Her name was Joanna Park. She was an attorney who specialized in employment and intellectual property, and she had been introduced to me by a former client of the firm's who had used her successfully in a business dispute. I had saved her card for reasons I had told myself were general and professional, and that I now understood were specific and personal. I told Joanna what I had found, and what I had built in 8 years, and what was being arranged without my knowledge or input. She listened to everything. Then she said, "Tell me about the operational systems you built. The project tracking system, the client communication protocol, the vendor database. Are they documented as your work?" I said, "I built them. They're on the firm's systems." She said, "Are they documented as your work? Is there a development record, version history, any attribution in the firm's internal materials?" I thought about this. I said, "The business consultant's report from 2 years ago attributes the client retention improvements to the systems I developed. My name is in the report." She said, "That's a start. Here's what I want you to do. Over the next 4 weeks, I want you to create a complete inventory of every system, process, and protocol you developed for the firm. Everyone. With dates, with documentation of the development process where it exists, with any evidence that establishes you as the originator. Can you do that?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. And I want you to do one more thing. I want you to document the work you are currently doing in real time. Every decision, every client interaction, every vendor management action. Daily, a running log for 4 weeks. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because what you're describing is a situation where the person who built the operational foundation of a business is about to watch someone else be placed over her in a newly created role at higher compensation, without her knowledge or input. And the question of whether that constitutes actionable harm depends in part on what that operational foundation actually consists of and who can demonstrate they built it." I said, "What kind of actionable harm?" She said, "At minimum, a negotiating position that is significantly stronger than the one you currently have. At maximum, something more significant that depends on what the firm's ownership structure says about intellectual property developed by employees." I had not read the firm's original partnership documents in several years. Joanna said, "Can you get access to those documents?" I said, I am the person who organizes and maintains the firm's legal files. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Cora, I think we have more to work with here than you realize. I spent the following 4 weeks building a case. I want to describe this accurately because the building of it required a specific kind of emotional discipline that I do not want to understate. I was going to work every day in the firm I had managed for 8 years, managing it the way I always managed it, while simultaneously documenting evidence for a legal consultation about that firm's treatment of my work. I was smiling at my mother in Monday morning planning meetings while photographing agreements she had not told me about. I was answering my father's questions about vendor timelines while creating a daily log of every decision that would establish, in dated and verifiable detail, what I actually did. I did not do any of this with anger as the primary fuel. Anger is not a sustainable fuel for precise work, and the work needed to be precise. What I used instead was clarity. The clarity that arrives when you have finally looked at something directly that you have been approaching from an angle for a long time, and you have seen its actual shape, and you understand that the shape requires a specific response. The operational systems inventory took 3 weekends. Every system I had built, documented with creation dates drawn from the firm's version history, with the business consultant's report as external attribution, with email threads from the development process that had my name in the originating position. The vendor database I had built from scratch in year 2. The client communication protocol I had designed in year 3. The project tracking system I had built in year 4 and refined in years 5 through 8. The financial reporting templates, the dispute resolution procedure, the post-project evaluation framework that had produced the client retention data the consultant had praised. It was 31 pages when Joanna reviewed it. She said, "This is substantial. More substantial than most people can document because most people don't maintain records this carefully." I said, "I maintained records carefully because that is what the job required." She said, "I know. That's the irony. The skill that made you invisible is the same skill that makes your position defensible." The partnership documents were interesting. The firm had been structured as an LLC with my parents as the sole members. Employee-developed intellectual property was addressed in the standard contractor, and employment agreements the firm used, work product, created by employees in the course of employment belonged to the firm. This was standard and expected, and was not a vulnerability I could exploit directly. What Joanna found more interesting was a clause related to key person provisions, a standard section that addressed what happened to firm operations if a key person became unavailable. The clause was standard, but had been poorly updated, and in its current form based on Joanna's reading, created some ambiguity about whether the operational systems I had developed constituted firm property in the conventional sense, or whether they might more accurately be characterized as professional methodology developed by a key person. She said, "I am not going to tell you this is a strong legal claim. It is not, but it is a credible argument that creates leverage in a negotiation. The distinction matters." I said, "What kind of negotiation?" She said, "The negotiation you're going to have with your parents before they make this official." I had not thought about a negotiation. I had been thinking about documentation. She said, "Cora, what do you actually want?" I thought about it. I said, "I want to be recognized for what I built. I want to be compensated fairly. I want to have a real title and a real role in the firm's future, not the operational infrastructure over which my sister is placed as the visible face." She said, "Then those are negotiable outcomes. The legal question is what leverage you have to negotiate toward them." I said, "And do I have leverage?" She said, "You have the systems, you have the documentation, you have 8 years of the business consultant's report. And you have the fact that the firm's client retention, the firm's reputation, and the firm's day-to-day functionality are all substantially dependent on your continued presence and your continued access to the systems you built." She paused. She said, "What happens if you leave?" I thought about this carefully. I said, "The firm can continue operating. The systems are documented and transferable. Priya could learn them. A new operations director could be hired. I said, but the institutional knowledge, the vendor relationships, the client history, the specific operational judgments I make daily, that takes years to rebuild. Joanna said, and your parents know this. I said, yes. She said, then they will understand the negotiation. Here is something I want to ask you. Have you ever been in a situation where you were doing the most essential work in a room while someone else received the recognition for it? Drop a comment below and tell me what that felt like. Because I want you to know that if you are sitting with that right now, what happens next is for you. The anniversary dinner was my parents' idea. 42 guests at Carmichael's private dining room, a restaurant they had been going to for 15 years, the kind of place that knows a family's history by their reservation preferences. My mother had been planning it for 6 months. I had been consulted on the logistics. I had helped address the invitations. I had confirmed the menu and managed the dietary restrictions and arranged the seating chart. I had not been consulted on the announcement. I found out about it through Priya, who called me 10 days before the dinner, voice bright and slightly too casual in the way of someone testing whether you already know a thing. She said, "So Mom told you about the creative director thing, right?" I said she mentioned she was thinking about it. Priya said, "It's happening. Dad's going to announce it at the dinner. I wanted you to know before the official thing." I said, "I appreciate you telling me." She said, "I know it's a lot. But you're so good at the operations side. This way we both have our lanes, you know?" I said, "I'll see you at the dinner, Priya." I hung up. I called Joanna. I told her my parents were planning a public announcement at the anniversary dinner. Joanna was quiet for a moment. She said, "They're going to announce it publicly before having any conversation with you." I said, "It appears so." She said, "In that case, I want to accelerate the documentation process. I want the full inventory and the daily log and the partnership document analysis in a completed folder by the end of the week. And I want you to make a decision." She said, "You can have the conversation with your parents before the dinner, which gives you the best chance of a real negotiation and the least amount of collateral family disruption. Or you can let the dinner happen and have the conversation after, from a position where the announcement is public and reversing it carries social cost for your parents." I said, "You're saying the second option is stronger." She said, "I'm saying it changes the negotiation. It doesn't guarantee the outcome you want. But yes, a public announcement that your parents then have to walk back creates a different set of incentives than a private plan they can quietly revise." I said, "And if they won't walk it back, if they are committed to it regardless?" She said, "Then you have a choice about what to do with the documentation and the leverage. A choice you can make from a position of preparation rather than from shock." I said, "Okay." She said, "Cora, I want to be clear about one more thing. Whatever you decide because it is what you want and what you believe is right. Not to punish anyone, not from anger, because you deserve to be recognized for what you built, and there is a correct and available way to pursue that recognition." I said, "I understand." She said, "Then go to the dinner. Know what you have. Let it play out." I attended my parents' 35th anniversary dinner in a deep green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I sat in my assigned seat between the couple I didn't know well and my cousin Marcus, who looked at his phone. I made conversation. I ate the appetizer. I smiled at the right moments. And when my father raised his glass and announced Priya as creative director, while 42 people applauded, and I sat with my hands in my lap and my smile in place, and the folder in my bag, I understood that something had been decided for me without my participation and that I was now going to participate. The dinner lasted 3 hours. I was present for all of it. I hugged my parents at the end. I told Priya congratulations, which I meant in the specific way you mean something that is technically accurate without being complete. I drove home through November streets and sat at my kitchen table. I called Joanna at 9:30. I said, "They announced it." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm ready." She said, "Monday morning. We'll schedule the meeting with your parents for Wednesday. I'll be on standby by phone. You'll deliver the folder in person and ask for a conversation about the firm's leadership structure. I said, okay. She said, get some sleep. I did not sleep particularly well, but I slept, which was its own form of discipline. Monday and Tuesday, I went to the firm and worked the way I always worked. My parents were in high spirits from the weekend's celebration. Priya had come in on Monday morning for what my mother described as an onboarding conversation. I overheard my mother explaining the major client relationships to Priya in the conference room. The client relationships I had managed for years. Priya was taking notes. I processed the week's vendor invoices. I followed up on a delayed delivery for the Henderson project. I prepared the monthly financial report. On Wednesday morning, I arrived at the firm at 7:30, an hour before my parents were usually in. I put the folder on the center of the conference room table. The folder contained the 31-page systems inventory, the daily log from the previous 4 weeks, a 2-page summary of the business consultant's report attributing client retention to my systems, a 1-page legal summary Joanna had drafted identifying the relevant provisions in the partnership documents, and a single additional page that I had written myself, not a legal document, a letter, 4 paragraphs, single-spaced, in my own voice, addressing my parents directly about what I had built and what I needed from the conversation. I sat down. My parents arrived at 8:30 together, the way they always arrived, which told me my mother had said something to my father about the Wednesday meeting I had requested and that they had prepared for it together. This was fine. I had prepared too. My father sat down. My mother looked at the folder on the table. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Please sit down. I'd like to talk about the firm's leadership structure." She sat. I said, "I've been at Bellamy Interior Design for 8 years. In that time, I built the operational systems that the business consultant identified as the primary driver of our client retention rate. I managed the firm during Dad's 14-month recovery without losing a single major client. I currently manage every operational aspect of the firm, from vendor relationships to project delivery to financial reporting." My mother started to speak. I said, "I'm not finished." She closed her mouth. My father was watching me with an expression I had not seen from him before. Something was being recalibrated behind his face. I said, "Last week, at your anniversary dinner, you announced Priya as creative director with a compensation package that is $23,000 above mine. You did this without any conversation with me about my role, my compensation, or what the structural change meant for the firm's operations. I found the employment agreement in the onboarding file 6 weeks ago." My mother's face changed. I said, "I am not here to make accusations. I'm here to have a conversation I should have been included in before the public announcement. The folder in front of you contains the documentation of what I have built and what the firm's operational continuity depends on. I have reviewed it with an employment attorney. I am asking you to read it before we continue." My mother did not reach for the folder. My father did. He opened it. He began reading. My mother sat beside him, and after a moment, she leaned toward the pages too. I sat across from them, and I let them read. It took 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the conference room wall that I had chosen and installed, and that had been on that wall for 6 years. When my father looked up, his expression had completed the recalibration. He said, "Cora, I didn't understand the full scope of what you've been doing." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "I did tell you. In every Monday morning meeting, in every quarterly review, in every email and report and operational summary for 8 years. You received the information. You didn't have a framework for its significance." My mother's voice, when it came, was careful in the way of someone who is choosing words knowing they will be held to them. She said, "I should have included you in the conversation about Priya's role." I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought," she stopped. She started again. "I thought you were settled. I thought you knew your value here. I didn't think you needed me to tell you." I said, "Mom, everyone needs to be told, especially the people who never ask for it." She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, "What do you want?" I had prepared the answer to this question carefully with Joanna. I said, I want a formal title that accurately represents my role, Chief Operations Officer or the equivalent. I want compensation aligned with that title. Specifically, I want a review of my compensation against current market rates for COO-level roles in comparable design firms, with adjustment to match. I want formal co-leadership recognition in the firm's materials, website, proposals, client communications, equal to whatever recognition Priya's creative director role receives. And I want a seat in every leadership conversation going forward, not a briefing after decisions are made. A seat in the room where they are made. My father said, those are reasonable requests. My mother looked at him. He said, Diane, she's right. Look at what she's built. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what happens to Priya's announcement? I said, Priya's role is hers to have. I'm not asking you to take it from her. I'm asking you to give me the recognition that matches mine. Both things can be true. My mother looked at the folder again. She said, I need some time. I said, of course. I'm available to continue this conversation whenever you're ready, but I want you to know that the conversation is not optional. I stood. I said, I love you both. I want to build something here together for the next 20 years. But I am not able to do that as the invisible infrastructure beneath a structure that doesn't include me. I left the conference room. I went to my desk. I opened the Henderson project file and finished the delivery coordination for the week. The conversation they had without me lasted, from what I could tell by the closed conference room door and the quality of the silence in the rest of the office, approximately 90 minutes. At 11:45, my mother knocked on my open office door. She said, Can we talk? I said, yes. She came in and sat across from me at my desk, which was a reversal of the usual geometry of conversations in that building, and I think the reversal was deliberate on her part. She said, Your father and I talked. We want to do this right. We want to give you the COO title and the compensation review, and we want you to be listed as a principal on the firm's materials alongside your father and me. I said, alongside. She said, alongside, not below. I looked at her. She said, there's something else. I waited. She said, I have not been fair to you, not for 8 years and not before that. I have been treating you as the one who would be fine regardless of what we gave you, because you were always fine. But fine isn't the same as valued. And you deserve to be valued. I said, yes, I did. She said, I'm sorry, Cora, specifically, not generally. I should have been in that conversation 6 weeks ago when we were talking about Priya. I should have been in every conversation about the firm's future. And I should have told you, years ago, what you meant to what we built. I said, what did I mean to what you built? She said, without hesitation, everything operational. The part that made the beautiful vision actually reach clients. The part that kept us solvent and reliable and retained. You built that, not us. I looked at my mother for a long moment. Then I said, thank you for saying it specifically. She said, I mean it specifically. We sat in my office for a little while longer. Not with resolution exactly. Years of a dynamic do not resolve in a conference room conversation. But with something that felt like the beginning of honesty, which is not nothing, which is in fact quite a lot. Joanna reviewed the formal agreement that Roland, the firm's business attorney, drafted over the following 2 weeks. The COO title was documented. The compensation adjustment, following a market rate review conducted by an outside HR consultant, was $51,000, more than the $23,000 I had calculated, because the market rate for a COO of a firm with Bellamy's revenue was higher than the internal comparison had suggested. The firm's website was updated. The proposal templates were updated. The email signatures in the firm's communication system were updated. Priya had a conversation with my parents that I was not part of, and that resulted in her creative director title remaining, and her role being clarified as client-facing creative work rather than overall firm leadership. She called me afterward. She said, I didn't know about the systems. I didn't know what you'd built. I said, I know. She said, I thought you were okay with the way things were. I said I was not okay with it. I was just quiet about it. She said, I'm sorry for my part in that. I said, thank you, Priya. I mean it. We have not resolved everything. Resolution is a longer project than a single phone call. But we are talking in a way we were not talking before, and the talking is honest in a way it was not before, and honest talking is the only foundation available for anything real. My mother and I have a standing coffee on Thursday mornings now. Not a work meeting, a coffee. She asks about my week in the specific way of someone who is learning a new practice, imperfectly and with genuine effort. I tell her things I would not have told her a year ago. It is not comfortable yet. I think it will become comfortable. My father tells me, in the way fathers have of saying things sideways, that the COO designation is the right one, that he should have formalized it years ago, that he is proud of how I handled it. He says the last part while looking at something else, which is the way he says everything he most means. The firm is growing. We brought in 2 new major clients in the 6 months since the restructuring, both of them specifically because of a referral from Mrs. Sato, a long-term client whose relationship I had managed for 5 years and who had mentioned, in her referral communications, that she chose us because of the operational reliability she had experienced. Operational reliability. The invisible thing, visible in its effects. I am currently developing a new service tier for the firm, a hybrid model that allows smaller clients to access design expertise at a lower price point through a technology-assisted project management process. The technology component is something I have been building in my personal time for 2 years. It has not yet been introduced to my parents. When I introduce it, I will introduce it with attribution and with a proposed equity structure for the development work. I have learned some things about how to be recognized for what I build. I sat in my office last week looking at the firm's updated website. My photograph is on the team page now, same size as my parents', same format. The title underneath says Cora Bellamirush, Chief Operations Officer and Principal. The bio I wrote is 4 sentences. It mentions the client retention work. It mentions the systems. It is accurate. I am 31 years old. I built something for 8 years in near total invisibility, and then I documented it and brought it into a room and asked to be seen. I was seen. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. The most dangerous thing you can be in a family business is the reliable one, the one everyone assumes will be fine. If you recognize yourself in this story, I want you to hear this. Your work deserves to be named, not assumed, not absorbed, named. Subscribe and stay with me, because next week I have a story about a woman who spent 14 years being the unnamed foundation of someone else's success, and the day she finally handed them an invoice.